My name is Jason Belzer. For those of you that don't know me, I am one of the co-founders at AthleticDirectorU. I'm joined today by one of my colleagues from ADU, Stephanie Garcia, and Korte Gosha, who is the athletics director at Florida A&M. We will also be joined later by Jim Cavale, who is the founder of INFLCR. So tonight's schedule is going to be, we're going to do about a 30 to 40 minute workshop. We're going to lead you through everything that you as a coach as well as administrators need to know about NIL. As everyone knows, this is something that is rapidly changing, literally by the minute. As some of you guys were following along today on social media and on television with the hearings in Washington, D.C. We do feel that we are pretty up to date on all of the information that we're going to provide. But again, there's a good chance that we're going to have another one of these conversations here in a couple of months once things get settled out. There's a Q&A that is currently open, so you guys can for sure ask questions as I go through this. This is meant to be interactive, so if you do have an interesting question, please ask. I cannot hear you as the host. I can only see the questions. Once we get through this workshop, though, we will do an open Q&A where you can raise your hand and speak, and everybody will be able to hear you. For now, just use the chat and the Q&A for us to have a conversation. I know some people are saying that they can't get in. We did have over 500 people register. So if for some reason somebody can't get in, I think maybe you can send a message to Troy Hilton and he can see what he can do, but I'm not sure if we can get anyone in. And then lastly, this will be posted after the fact here in a couple of days on AthleticDirectorU and on the NABC's website. So let's get into it here. So just a brief overview of how we got to where we are today and the current state of affairs in college athletics. It's important to understand this history for everybody so that we understand why we are where we are. There's been a long advocacy for student athletes to have the opportunity to potentially earn and monetize their name, image, and likeness. College athletics existed for a good or better part of about 80 years till the Board of Regents case in 1984, where the NCAA attempted to control the media rights associated with college football. And the Board of Regents of Oklahoma and Georgia ended up filing a lawsuit against the NCAA in 1984. And in that lawsuit, they ended up beating the NCAA, and the NCAA was found to essentially not have an antitrust exemption. And what an antitrust exemption says is that unlike in the NFL or the NBA or the MLB, where different school or different organizations can collude to work together and essentially create a monopoly, the NCAA did not have that capability. And what that ended up doing is that it ended up giving the schools the rights to market and sell their own television rights. And that ended up infusing massive amounts of money into the college athletic sphere. That led to the creation of the Bowl Championship Series in 1998, which created multi-million-dollar bowl games. And then not too long ago in 2011, where our modern history begins, the NCAA signed what now worth over $17 billion contract with TBS, CBS, and True TV for the NCAA tournament. So NIL really begins 10 years ago with the NCAA's new contract. And some of you may remember in 2012, Taylor Branch wrote an article for The Atlantic called The Shame of College Sports. I had written an article called National Letter of Indenture for Forbes magazine, and that really set off this argument for student athletes' abilities to have an opportunity to monetize their name, image, and likeness. We go to 2014, and we have a resolution in the NCAA O'Bannon case. Many of you guys know who Ed O'Bannon is. Ed O'Bannon sued the NCAA saying, why is it that after I graduated and played at UCLA and I see myself in a video game, I sort of understand that I can't be paid while I'm in school, but why is it that I wasn't paid when I got out of school? And so what ends up happening is that he sues EA, he sues the NCAA, and EA settled that case in 2014 with O'Bannon. The NCAA said we are not settling, and that actually transformed into the Alston case, which we all have heard about and was heard before the Supreme Court about 2 months ago now. And that case deals with NIL, that case deals with antitrust, and will have a major impact, and has already had a major impact on what the NCAA can and cannot do when it comes to controlling what's about to happen in the name, image, and likeness space. So at a very high level, what is name, image, and likeness? We can look at name, image, and likeness as 3 core areas. Number 1, student athletes will be allowed to endorse products and services, just like a professional athlete would. So not just from a monetization standpoint, not just from a, hey, I'm about to get paid to do this endorsement, the sheer fact that they can now appear on behalf of a brand, whether they're paid or not, creates an opportunity to create value for themselves. They can be compensated for those services for use of their NIL. And lastly, they can hire an agent to represent them and their NIL interests. So we will go through each of these in depth over the next 30 to 40 minutes, but I want to make sure that you guys understand, particularly the hiring of an agent. This does not mean that a college basketball player can go sign with Rich Paul tomorrow, and Rich Paul is going to start negotiating on behalf of that individual with their coach. That's not how it works. They have to hire a certified marketing representative, a marketing agent, not somebody that's representing them contractually. That all has to get worked out here, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. But there are certain limitations to what they can do. It's also important and actually pretty cool to think about the fact that NIL is not just about making money. It's not just about doing endorsement deals. One of the really awesome opportunities that student athletes are going to have now is that brands are going to be able to do business with student athletes. And what that means is, for example, if I'm the Coca-Cola company and I want to hire Devontae Smith, the Heisman winner from this past year, to do an internship for me or work for me over the summer because he's Devontae Smith, I will now be able to do that. I will now be able to hire a student athlete. Maybe I'm not even going to pay them. Maybe it's going to be a 4-credit internship, but I can hire them because they're a student athlete. As of today, NCAA rules do not allow, obviously, extra benefits for student athletes like being hired for a job because they play for a particular team or not. So this is where it gets complicated. NIL is not just one thing, it's a lot of things. So the map that you see in front of you right now shows the current state of NIL legislation at each state level. So the NCAA does not have any NCAA rules as it relates to the NIL. There was the assumption that back in January, the NCAA was going to create a set of legislative rules that were going to be put in to writing that were going to control all of what was happening as it related to NIL. They decided to wait. And one of the reasons why they decided to wait was because they were banking on the Alston case potentially being ruled in their favor, and we still don't know the decision of the Alston case, and then potentially getting an antitrust exemption so that they could, for example, cap the amount of money that a student athlete can make based on NIL. That, of course, has not happened. And what has actually happened over the last 6 months is that more and more states have created state legislation that allows their student athletes to monetize their name, image, and likeness. All of that legislation is different from state to state. It's comparatively similar, but each state has their own particular rules and nuances as to how NIL is going to work. So let's just focus for a moment on, we have 6 states as of right now, this minute, and I say this minute because by the end of the week, it's likely this is going to change, that are going to go live July 1. Arizona goes live July 23rd, but New Mexico, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida will be live July 1, and student athletes can monetize their name, image, and likeness starting July 1. Louisiana, Texas, Missouri, and Illinois, those 4 states, have the legislation has passed both their House and Senate and is now sitting on the desk of the governor to be signed into law. So we assume that literally any day tomorrow, it might be Louisiana, the next day it might be Illinois, these will come into effect. There's a decent chance that there are a few other states that will go into effect. All being equal, we would project that about 10 to 15 states will be live July 1. Again, all with different rules as to what student athletes can and cannot do. So a great example, I'll put my own home state of New Jersey up here, who's always behind the times. Their legislation doesn't go into effect until 2025. So if a Rutgers student athlete wants to monetize their name, image, and likeness, or a coach at Rutgers wants to talk to their students about NIL, they're basically telling them, well, you can't do anything until 2025. But if you go down to Florida or you go play for Arizona, you can start making money July 1. That's obviously a huge recruiting disadvantage for an institution in a state that hasn't gone live. The NCAA is highly, highly unlikely to do anything from a national perspective before July 1. What is likely to happen, and we're going to see this probably in 2 weeks, is the NCAA is going to have no choice but to tell states and tell institutions in states with NIL laws that they can proceed and that those student athletes in those institutions will not be penalized. Then they are going to wait on Congress, as again, we saw the hearing today, to create a legislation that will cover all of the schools in all of the states in a uniform legislation. That may take many, many months. We project that it will probably happen before the end of the year, but it is very likely that there will be numerous states that will not have NIL on the books until a federal law passes through the House and through the Senate. So let's look about and talk about how much student athletes actually could make. So the first thing we're going to look at is licensing value for student athletes. Now, this is a complete hypothetical because come July 1, student athletes are not going to have the opportunity to pursue collective bargain licensing opportunities. Why? Because there is no collective bargaining unit. There is no union for student athletes. And so until that happens, and we don't know if it's ever going to happen, student athletes likely are not going to be able to create licensing revenue for them. So for example, we all may have heard that EA is bringing back the college football game in 2 years. If they wanted to start using actual student athletes, they would have to individually do the deals with those student athletes in NIL states. They couldn't just say, hey, we're going to pay each student athlete $1,000. If Nike wanted to do a deal with every student athlete at a Nike school, it couldn't be collectively bargained because there is no bargaining unit. But if we were looking at it from a collective bargaining standpoint, we project that athletes would get anywhere between about $1,000 to $10,000 from a student athlete perspective if there was some sort of collective bargaining for these big brands. There's a question from Arthur Jackson. What if an athlete lives in Florida but ends up at a New Jersey school? That athlete will not be able to monetize their name, image, and likeness. So they may be from Florida, but if they're going to Rutgers, Rutgers cannot allow them to do it. The opposite works though. If you're in a state with NIL legislation, it doesn't matter where your state of residency is, or that if you're a dependent and your parents or guardians live in a state without NIL laws. It's all about the institution. It's tied to the institution and the state, not where the student athlete is from. So now let's talk about real money and real opportunity. So AthleticDirectorU last year, many of you may have read a piece of content that we published where we created a formula to kind of project what student athletes could potentially be worth. Now, the numbers you see on screen here, we have 3 student athletes, Trevor Lawrence, of course, who went #1 to the Jacksonville Jaguars, Justin Fields, who went #10 to the Chicago Bears, and then Spencer Rattler, who is the projected darling of college football this year. the starting quarterback at the University of Oklahoma. The numbers that you see on screen, they do not reflect that Spencer Rattler is going to make $345,000 this year in NIL. What it looks at is says that an athlete, a professional athlete with a comparative social media reach, in this case of about 370,000 Instagram followers and 60,000 Twitter followers, makes about $345,000 a year in off the field opportunities. So the formula, if you just want to ballpark it, it's about 0.8 cents a follower on Instagram. So if you have your point guard has 100,000 followers on Instagram, they can project to potentially make $80,000. You can kind of ballpark it in that area. So there's a couple of things to talk about here that are important. The first thing is that student athletes are going to allow to be doing deals based on market value. What does market value mean? Well, that's a really good question, and no one really knows what the answer is. What market value means is that as of today, if you ask me as an attorney, it means what does a professional athlete doing a similar deal make? But of course, that changes depending on where the athlete plays, what position he's in or she is in. So it ranges. What I think we're really trying to say, and what these states are trying to say, is that, for example, if Spencer Rattler all of a sudden does $1 million deal with a local Hyundai dealership in Oklahoma, that probably is not fair market value, especially if a Dallas Cowboys player is only getting $50,000 for a similar deal. So that has to get worked out, and that probably is not going to get worked out before July 1, but it's a big question. It's also worth noting that come July 1, we're going to see a lot of athletes do deals. We will not see a lot of athletes do deals with major brands. You will not see Coca-Cola and Home Depot and Dr. Pepper and Delta Airlines signing athletes everywhere. It's not going to happen for two reasons. Number one, major brands are going to be very apprehensive about immediately working with student athletes, and then even long-term working with student athletes, because as we all know, student athletes maybe are not mature enough to make great decisions. And do you, as a major multi-billion-dollar company, want to have those people endorsing your brand? Secondly, every major corporation, really every company, plans their marketing budgets at least 1 year, if not multiple years in advance. So in the middle of the summer, it's not like they have this pot of money sitting around ready to just spend on something random and new. The deals that we're going to see are going to be small, nimble, upstart companies that may want to try to do something disruptive and are going to try to get into the space and make a name for themselves. We have a question for Maura. If a student athlete elects to engage in NIL activities that are consistent with the protected by the laws of the state in which they are considered a legal resident or an institution located, eligibility for internship will not be impacted. Okay. So if a student athlete elects to engage in NIL, so Maura is saying that that is not the case, that if they're a legal resident in that state, that they can, in fact, engage in NIL activities. So then that is fine. Although I think the institution that they play in another state may have issue with that. So this is all, again, a gray area as to how this is going to work. And as Maura states, there may be different states. Each state has different legislation. So I can say for a fact, Maura may be right for Florida hypothetically, but that might not necessarily be correct for Arizona. So you're going to have to read the legislation in each one of your states if you have an institution or if you have student athletes coming from out of state to ensure that you are following the right rules. The last thing I'm going to say about this is that the vast majority of deals that student athletes engage in to make money will be social media based. I would project that somewhere between 80 and 90% of all revenue that will be made or all deal flow that will occur with student athletes is going to be through social media influencing. And that is because it's going to be easiest to execute. There will be a smaller percentage of deals that are done on the regional and local levels. So say you're at a a Conference USA school or a Mountain West school, and you don't necessarily have a Trevor Lawrence, but your quarterback is pretty well known in the state of Texas, he might be able to do a deal in the state of Texas with a car dealership, do a commercial. But most of the deals, you're not going to be seeing student athletes popping up on television all of a sudden doing endorsements for all kinds of products. It's going to take time for that. And the national level endorsements are going to be few and far between. They're going to be the elite student athletes, the first round draft picks, the first round individuals. There's a question from Tony Fowler. I've heard that brands that are partnered with the university athletic department cannot sign an athlete from the same university athletic department. Is that correct? That is in fact 100% false. Basically saying, can a student athlete work with an athlete? Can a Nike work with a student athlete at a Nike school? Can a Adidas athlete work with Nike? The answer is, at least by most state legislation as of today, it works both ways, yes. But there are certain rules and restrictions that we will discuss as we go through this. So just quickly to highlight, and again, something absolutely awesome for us is that female student athletes are going to be able to make likely substantially more money than males. If you look at the average follower count for female student athletes on social media, it is much higher than their male counterparts. Females are usually almost always more social media savvy. And so what we're going to end up seeing is a lot of brands that don't necessarily already work in college athletics, especially ones targeting females and the female demographic, start moving in and doing individual and maybe group type endorsements with student athletes, particularly female student athletes in softball, in gymnastics, and other sports. So I want to give you guys an overview of the business of NIL, and we're going to discuss a couple of different organizations, companies that some of you may have seen on social media. Some of you may have, actually your universities are already working with them in some capacity, but you may not understand what each one of them does. And so what we've done here is kind of organized, and I'm going to attempt to explain by who they get paid by, what their position is in the industry. So probably the two biggest and most well-known names are both Opendorse and Influencer. So there's a word up here or an acronym that says TPA, and TPA stands for third party administrator. So the NCAA early on put out a bid for a TPA for NIL, and the third party administrator is essentially somebody, an entity like Opendorse, that is going to review all of the transactions that occur at a university as they relate to NIL. So when a student athlete wants to do an endorsement of a product or a service, the contract and the information as it relates to that service has to run through the TPA, and the TPA makes sure that, for example, they're getting market rate, right? They're not being paid more money than they should be, that endorsement is not coming from a booster tied to the university, and all of these other elements, right? So Opendorse is a TPA. They're somebody that had bid for the TPA to do that. They are a marketplace. So student athletes will be able to go on and find deals to do. So they're going to go on and, to say hypothetically, a Coca-Cola saying, we're looking for all the starting quarterbacks of all the Power 5 teams. If you're interested, come in, and we're looking to do a deal, an endorsement deal with you guys. And they're also a tool for the student athletes to be able to build their brand, build their social media following, and all of that, right? So they're all of it. So they make money through the school deals. The schools pay them. They make money by taking a cut of what the student athlete is getting from a deal. And they also make money from the brand side. Influencer is a little bit different. Influencer only gets paid by the schools, period, end of story. Schools sign with Influencer, and Influencer, first and foremost, is a tool to help student athletes manage and build their brands and social media presence. And then it's also a marketplace of marketplaces. So for example, influencer, if you go on the influencer app when NIL launches, you'll be able to access Icon Source, which is a marketplace. You'll be able to access other companies that are offering services to student athletes, but influencer is not involved in those deals. They're simply giving the student athletes access and then monitoring and managing them. Icon Source and NoCap are markets and tools. So again, marketplaces that allow student athletes to find deals for themselves and tools to empower those student athletes. Icon Source makes its revenue directly from the deals that are cut. NoCap Sports, on the other hand, makes the money from the deals and from the student athletes. Now, what you may be thinking in your head right now is that there could be a little bit of a conflict of interest from some of these deals, right? How can you get paid by the school, but also potentially get paid by the student athletes and the brands? And that's something that we're all trying to figure out and hasn't been clarified with really anyone yet. So continuing on, Compass is a TPA. Compass is a partnership between CLC, the Collegiate Licensing Company, and Game Plan, the e-learning platform. I believe Alabama and Mississippi State are using Compass as their TPA and education platform. Altius Partners is only education. They've signed a number of Power 5 institutions to do NIL education. Student Athlete NIL, or SNIL, is a brand agency that works with the brands to help connect them with student athletes. So they are paid directly through the brands. And then, of course, we have the traditional and large sports and entertainment agencies, the three biggest in the world being Wasserman, CAA, and Excel. And those individuals will, number one, work with student athletes. So they will be signing student athletes and representing them in deals. And they will also obviously be working with brands to help connect them. So for the most part, and this may change, we don't know how this marketplace is going to look like in a year or two. But come July 1, the 10 or so logos that you see up here, as well as a couple of other ones, there's Spry, there's a few others, are likely going to be the largest entities that are involved in the business of NIL. Quick question here. There's two questions I want to answer. Can student athletes market themselves to companies in the same field? I.e., can a student athlete at Yale promote Sally's Pizza and Frank Pope at the same time? The answer to that is that technically yes, but it's unlikely that a company is going to do an endorsement with somebody and not make it an exclusive endorsement, right? If I'm doing something with Nike, I think Nike is going to say, obviously, you're not doing anything with Adidas or you're going to be in breach of contract. Have you heard that institutions cannot use the TPAs that serve a marketplace directly or indirectly? Would Open Doors have issues with that? Yes. So that is one of the conflicts, is that technically, based on what the NCAA originally mandated, and we know that the NCAA is not really a factor in this yet, or will ever be a factor, they basically said that you can't be a TPA and be a marketplace, because there's a conflict of interest, right? You can't be brokering the deals, you can't be the deal maker and be the person that's reviewing the deals. That probably is not going to end up well, or you can end up having a conflict of interest in that. So a major issue, and schools are obviously trying to figure out whether or not they should be working with any of these entities or none of them. Will student athletes be bound to use the same companies the university selects? So the answer is no, but it depends, right? So a marketplace, a student athlete can be on Open Doors, they can be on Icon Source, and they potentially can be on NoCap all at the same time. They also, you know, if their school uses Altius as an educational partner, they're probably going to use Altius, but they can go to somebody else if they can find the education elsewhere. But no, they will not be bound to only use, say, Open Doors or Influencer. That's absolutely not. That being said, as far as I understand, both Open Doors and Influencer are not offering their services to student athletes outside of the schools that they sign with, other than Open Doors is marketplace. Influencer is exclusive to the schools. And I think Jim Cavale will be able to explain that here when he comes on. So let's look at a hypothetical NIL deal and how this is going to work. So we're going to use Old Spice. I'm going to actually use a real NFL endorsement with a student athlete that all of you guys know to explain this. So you have Old Spice. Old Spice says, hey, we want to start working with student athletes. What do we do? So the first thing that they're likely going to do is they're going to go to their agency of record, whoever is representing them. So in this case, we're going to say hypothetically that student athlete NIL represents Old Spice and says, we are going to go identify a group of student athletes that we're going to do some endorsement deals with. How are we going to get in touch with those student athletes? Well, they're going to really have two options. They can either go to a marketplace like Open Doors, or they can go to the agency. In the situation in which a major brand like an Old Spice or Coca-Cola or somebody else, they're likely going to go to the agency because it's likely that that student athlete is big enough to be represented by an agent. Most student athletes are probably not going to have an actual marketing agent. They're going to be using marketplaces. They're going to be able to go on and find deals through those marketplaces. Once they identify the student athlete and they want to they reach out to their agent or they go through Open Doors and they want to start doing the deal, that deal is going to have to get reported and run through a TPA. So in this case, because we're going to use this Alabama student athlete, they're going to use Compass. Compass is the clearinghouse, the TPA, that's going to manage and monitor the deal and clear it out. They're also going to have to, the brand and the student athlete are going to have to do education around it, right? So a lot of people don't even realize this, but brands are mandated to do education as part of these deals. That deal then goes to Alabama for final approval. Alabama looks at it. Compass says it looks good. Alabama has to double check, make sure that there are no conflicts of interest, that a booster is not involved in this, that the coach is aware, even though technically the deal can still happen, but they're just running through. And this happens potentially very quickly. And then that deal actually goes through, right? The student athlete, in this case, Derrick Henry, who plays for the Tennessee Titans but won the Heisman with Alabama, gets to do the deal. And then he leverages a platform like Influencer, for example, to send out his tweets. He's going to go through his Instagram influencer platform. He's going to send out his tweets saying, hey, I used Old Spice today before the game. It really helped me keep me cool. And Influencer is going to send that out. They're going to provide him with the AP photographs he's going to be able to use. They're going to actually monitor the deal and are going to look at it and say, hey, you got some awesome interaction. They're going to send that back to it. So this is kind of an outflow of approximately what a deal would look like. We have a question from Michael Jones. If a student athlete at my institution is approached for an endorsement opportunity by a booster and he can't do it, and now is approached for the same deal by a local business who is not a booster, can he do the deal with the non-booster? That is going to be a regulation by the school, but generally speaking, it is highly unlikely, in our opinion, that any university is going to let people or their student athletes do deals with boosters. But I have to say that with a caveat, right? Because there are many alumni, there are many people that donate to schools who may work for a company. What if you have a donor who also works for Coca-Cola? Does that mean that you can never do a deal with Coca-Cola? It has to be clear that the deal is coming from Coca-Cola and it's not coming from the person that's directly making the donation to the university. So what can schools not do? What can't schools do? So we have 4 core areas as of today that we know that every state legislation that's active says, okay? Schools cannot help secure endorsement opportunities for student athletes. Period, end of story. Schools cannot say, come here, we're going to get you the biggest deals with the biggest brands, you're going to be a millionaire. Absolutely not. They can't even make promises or claims around that. So what that means is you can't even say, hey, come play at Ohio State, and because you're going to be in Columbus, you're going to get all of these big deals because we have all of these big Fortune 500 companies. In fact, first of all, that's not true, right? Actually being in a big city doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get more deals than otherwise, but you can't even make those types of claims. But what you can do, what is allowed, and Jim Cavale will talk about this, is to say, hey, our student athletes that are here now have made X dollars from their deals. So Justin Fields, who played here, did $500,000 a year in endorsement. And so that gives you a ballpark. Maybe you can make it, maybe you can't. We can't make any promises, but you can obviously show what former student athletes or current student athletes are making. That's okay. They cannot prevent a student athlete from doing business with somebody. Now, that obviously excludes deals with tobacco, liquor companies, firearms. But if a student athlete, for example, wants to endorse a condom company or even a strip club or something crazy, the school can't actually get involved with that. They're not allowed to tell a student athlete you can or you cannot do that. And based on the interpretation of the state laws, most schools cannot even tell them that you can't do a deal with or can't do a deal with one of our adversarial partners. If we're a Nike school, they can't say you can't do a deal with an Adidas. Again, there are limitations on that. We'll talk about that here in a moment, but you can do that. Can Derek, somebody asked me a question here just a second ago, can Derek Henry use the marks and logos without permission of the university? He cannot, right? He cannot wear an Alabama logo on his endorsement deal without the permission of the university. He may never, ever be able to do that, but the school colors are a separate conversation, and that's a state-by-state thing. Why can't a brand just reach out to an athletic department or shoot the athlete a DM? It's not so simple. But yes, athletes can be contacted any way they want, and that's important. So they don't have to go through a marketing or a marketplace, an agency or the brand itself, but every major brand works with an agency, can reach out to the student athletes directly, and that is happening today. There are student athletes that are having conversations with brands, and those conversations didn't happen through open doors. They happened through a telephone call or a connection or something else. So lastly, moving on here, the university cannot have any contact with the money that's flowing between the student athlete and the potential partner. Again, these deals will be monitored. They will flow through a TPA or some kind of other service, but the money that goes between the student athlete and the brand is not going through the school's bank account. It's not even going through an escrow account. It's either going through open doors, it's going through their agent, or it's going directly into their bank account. So there is no issue from that perspective. So here's a quick quiz for everybody. Can a coach be featured in one of their student athletes' paid social media posts so long as they were not involved in procuring the actual endorsement or being compensated anything for that appearance? What do we think? So the answer is a very clear no. The university and the agents of the university, the coaches, the administrators, anyone that works at the school cannot be in any type of paid advertising or endorsement opportunity for the student athletes, right? So Nick Saban cannot be in Devontae Smith's TikTok as long as it's not something that he's, or if he's getting paid for that TikTok. So that kind of goes to the next question. What if a staff member at the school uses their iPhone, uses the student athlete's iPhone to film them doing a paid TikTok? So a little bit different in this situation, right? There's no one actually in the video other than the student athlete. In this scenario, it's a double no, because there's two things going on here, and it's sort of a trick question. The first issue is that, number one, the school cannot help the student athlete actually produce content that is being monetized. That's number one, right? So even if it's the student athlete's phone, the school cannot engage in helping the student athlete produce content. But the second issue is that a student athlete is prohibited from actually creating the content in the locker room in the first place if they're getting paid for it. In fact, most laws are saying that you can't be on campus. You can be in your dorm room, but you can't be at an athletic facility. You can't be on the field. So if you're doing it, even if it's for a non-competing brand, but definitely if it's for a competing brand, you can't actually be in the locker room. So even if the student athlete did the TikTok themselves, they would be in a violation because they're doing it on school grounds and on campus grounds. Forget about whether or not they're even wearing school colors. That's an issue. So what can schools do, and what must they do? So the first two things that you see on this screen are things that the school actually must do. They must do two things. They have to educate every student athlete on the legal and NCAA compliance rules as it relates to NIL. It is mandated by the laws in the state that they do so. They also must educate and train student athletes on issues of financial literacy. So those are mandated by law that they must do that. They must have classes, they must have an e-learning platform. We'll talk about some of that a little bit later, that they must do this. They can do three more things. They can help provide additional related best practice education and development opportunities. So Altius and Game Plan are examples of that, things that can allow student athletes to learn to build their brands, to do deals. They can provide tools and services for student athletes to grow their brands. So that's an example of open doors and influencer. And then they can assist, but they cannot recommend the athlete interviewing and signing with an agent. And a lot of major institutions have been doing that for a long time. A lot of major institutions have had professional sports counseling panels. They've had agent days. So that's already kind of happening. Are students, so a couple of questions here. Heidi Simmons, are students prohibited from using university content captured during games? The answer is generally yes, right? Because that is licensed content. So if it's coming from like a CBS or an ESPN, that's owned by CBS or ESPN. If it's owned by the school can license it back to the student athlete. That can potentially occur through a platform like Influencer. And Influencer does, for example, have an exclusive deal with AP Photography. But yes, you can't just use the school's, you can't just cut something from the school's website and use it. What if the student athlete's dad is a coach? I guess that's a hypothetical, but it doesn't matter, because if the coach works for the school, he cannot do anything with the student athlete. Are you saying that schools can and cannot do these things? Isn't it really up to the state law that exists under it? So what we are showing you today is what all of the current state laws, as they say, are essentially allowing student athletes to do. All the state laws are pretty similar. Some of them are a little bit more restrictive. Some of them are a little bit less restrictive. But for the most part, these are what is and what is not allowed as of today. Most of the state laws require that athlete agents be registered in their applicable state. Does that apply with individual companies that would broker a deal between? So the agent has to be registered. So if, for example, a CAA agent, and we're going to talk about agents here more in a moment, if a CAA agent is trying to represent a student athlete, they have to be registered in the state. It's not the actual agency. But yes, every time a student athlete is represented, the Uniform Athlete Agent Act requires an agent that is representing an athlete to be registered in that state. What do you mean by assist but not recommend? So what I mean by that is a school cannot, and this has always been the case, say you should go sign with this agent because they're the best. That is a clear conflict of interest in that case. They can say, hey, we're having an agent day, there's 20 agents coming, they all want to meet with you, but they can't say this agent is, they can say, hey, here's the information about the agent, but they can't say this is a great agent because he signed lots of $1 million deals, and this one's really bad because he just started. They can't recommend the actual party that's involved. So we have a question from Matt Elkin, but I think I'm going to go over it right now. So here's a hypothetical. What if a student athlete comes to you as a coach and says a sponsor's threatening to terminate their deal, costing them thousands of dollars unless they get playing time or more playing time? This is going to happen, and it's going to happen a lot, okay? What are the outcomes that we can think about in this situation? There's three outcomes that I see in this situation. The first is that the student athlete doesn't get playing time, the coach doesn't give in, and the student athlete loses their endorsement. The second outcome is the playing time doesn't increase and the student athlete transfers because they say, hey, I'm going to try to keep this endorsement by going to another school where I can play more, right? Or make more money or whatever it is. The third outcome is the scarier outcome. The playing time doesn't increase, the student athlete loses their endorsement, And then the student athlete potentially files a lawsuit against the coach and the institution for damages that they lost because of that. Now, you might say, is that really possibly going to happen? And I will say, absolutely. I will guarantee you we will be sitting here 12 months from now, and there will be these types of lawsuits. And how do you avoid that? Well, one of the things that you can avoid by doing that is actually making any promises as it relates to playing time. If you are recruiting a student athlete and you tell that student athlete, you're going to be our starting point guard or quarterback, and you put that in writing, you can bet that that potentially can come and bite you in the ass when that student athlete gets benched or isn't getting that time, and all of a sudden they're losing endorsements. And there are going to be plenty of student athletes, especially high level ones, that are going to get tons of endorsements because they're going to go play at a big school. They're the darling, they're going to turn the program around, and all of a sudden they lose all those endorsements because their coach says, hey, I'm not sure I even want to start this kid anymore. So that's something, just a little bit of an area to be focused on, is making sure that you're not making promises that can directly lead to a student athlete saying, hey, this affected my ability to make money later on in the future. So another hypothetical, this time on agents, and this is really important both in college basketball primarily and college football, but other sports. What happens if you as a coach have the same agency or agent that represents student athletes? So if you're represented today by CAA or Wasserman, and that agency now is recruiting one of your student athletes or actually represents one of your recruits, are you obligated to disclose that? Is there a conflict of interest in that transaction? This is a question not only for coaches, this is a question for the athletic departments in general. I can tell you as an agent that works with coaches that the vast majority of institutions that I have worked with and the coaches that I represent, the AD almost never knows what agent that person works with or agency that they're involved in. It just never gets asked. It has to start getting asked. Because here's a bigger question. What happens if an agent, maybe not even one that represents you, just an agent or agency, signs multiple players on your team or recruits that you're recruiting and comes to you and says, hey, your entire recruiting class, I represent them. And unless you do ABC, they're all leaving or they're all going to go into the transfer portal. That is a problem. And this is going to happen. And it's not just going to happen with big agents. What's going to end up happening here is that we're going to have a lot of people that are going to become agents overnight, trying to represent student athletes and doing all sorts of things to create leverage and opportunities for themselves. There will be people that are going to take advantage of NIL, and they're going to try to take advantage of student athletes, and they're going to try to take advantage of coaches and institutions in the process. So let's talk about defense. What is it that we can do? We're kind of getting to the end of this presentation. I'm going to try to give you some quick hitters here on some of the things that we really want to focus on. So in our opinion, empowerment is going to be your program's greatest asset and offense in the NIL world. So in professional sports, now college sports is going to be all about the student athlete. It already is about the student athlete, but the power structure is shifting, and it's shifting towards the student athletes. The student athletes are going to have their rights, and they're going to have the power. And so you have to choose to swim with the tide, not against it. You have to embrace NIL. So what you should be doing as coaches in particular and athletic departments is saying, you got to go to the student athletes, and we have to empower the student athletes to make decisions. We should be saying, what do you want to do? Not what should we be doing or how should we be dictating how you operate, but what it is within the rules do the student athletes want to accomplish and do. So for example, you should be going to your student athletes, your team, and saying, how do we maximize our NIL opportunities? Do you guys want to, for example, put your social media handles on the back of your jerseys? That should not be a coach decision. It shouldn't even be an athletics department decision. That should be a decision made on the student athlete. You can also talk about, how do I structure my in and off season schedules to maximize free time to engage in NIL activities? there's so many aspects of this we haven't talked about. And that's one of the reasons also why these big deals are probably not going to happen right away, is because if I'm a college football player, how am I going to go shoot a commercial in the middle of the season, right? How am I going to fly somewhere and film a commercial when I'm practicing 5 or 6 days a week and I got game day and I got pregame? It doesn't really work that way, right? So you have to think about addressing that today. You guys are making your practice schedules for the summer and for the fall. You should already be thinking, NIL is going to be a thing. How do I ensure that my student athletes have this space built in? Or how do I have a conversation with them and say, hey, guys, let's figure out what day do we want off? When can we make sure that we're maximizing this opportunity for you? You should be engaging with the student athletes as much as possible. So here's another hypothetical, somewhat related to the conversation we just had. Your star player hosts a youth camp during the summer at a local rec center during the same week as the coaches camp at the school. So, you know, this is the NABC, this is a basketball situation. Your basketball student athletes, your point guard is having a camp. He hires his teammates to be counselors at the camp. So they're not working your camp, they're working his camp. And guess what? You guys are a Nike program, but he's now sponsored by Adidas. Remember, he's off campus. Okay, he can use another partner. And everyone at the camp is wearing the jersey colors of your school. Remember, not the logo. And it's not Nike, it's Adidas. So everybody is wearing yellow. You guys are a yellow and gold school, and they got it. What are your options in this situation? What can you do? Again, hypothetical. The first thing you can do is be adversarial, and you can say, I'm going to send a cease and desist. Now, it's kind of tough to send the cease and desist in this area, but you can make the argument. You can say, hey, I'm running a camp. You're going against the camp. You're wearing school colors. This is pretty clear that you're trying to create an ambush marketing situation. Obviously, that is probably not your desired strategy in this case, because you're probably going to upset your student athlete and probably destroy the relationship. The other option is that you just let them do it. And quite frankly, there's going to be a lot of coaches that do just that. They're just going to say, I guess that's it. Or your third option, and this goes back to what we just said, is how about before the summer ever comes around, you say, hey guys, we're going to do a workshop and I'm going to teach you how to run a great clinic so that you guys can go run a great clinic. And by the way, just let me know when you guys are going to do your clinic, because I obviously want to do a clinic. I want to make sure I get my staff paid. So let's just coordinate and make sure that we're not doing it at the same time, so we both can maximize our opportunities. That's okay. And that's the smart thing to do, and be preemptive in the process of doing it. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Will an institution's multimedia right holders like Learfield be able to sell student athlete marketing rights? Will they be able to package those student athlete opportunities and institution assets? That answer is 100% no. Learfield, Playfly, any of these companies will not have the capability to sell student athlete rights. Major conflict of interest. And that is in every state law, that the schools are not allowed to do that. There's no packaging, none of that. Now, it doesn't mean that you may not see you may see a student athlete appear in a commercial with an endorser of a program, right? Coke is doing a student athlete, but that's two separate deals done in two separate ways and then bought together. The school is not involved in that process. We have a question about Title IX. Title IX, it's an interesting question. It's a debatable situation. The key quote here about Title IX, or the situation, is that as long as you're offering equal opportunity and services to your student athletes, both male and female, you shouldn't have a lot of Title IX issues. So what we mean by that, for example, is that you can't just give your football team influencer and not the female student athletes. That creates an issue. And we know that right now because there are some teams that only have influencer for certain programs. Once NIL becomes a reality, you may have a significant Title IX issue on your hand if you're doing that. What about international students and visas? That's an interesting question. There was an article today in ESPN about that. That's a great question. Here's another question I'll throw right back at you. What about Ivy League students that are on grants, right? They don't have scholarships. A lot of them have grant money. If you start making income, that's going to directly offset the money that this institution is subsidizing. Does NIL even do anything for Ivy League students? That's going to have to get worked out here too. Can a student athlete use a tool like influencer for in-game photos from AP on their social account? Do they need to have different social accounts? So if you're not using a photograph that you or one of your parents took, then yes, absolutely. Influencer does provide student athletes with the AP photography and they get the great picture. I just scored the big touchdown. They can go right on their phones into the influencer app and access that photo through AP and get it done and licensed in the right way. NFTs with student, again, schools and student athletes will not be sharing deals. They will not be doing revenue deals. NFTs or any other asset, it's not happening. Schools and student athletes are going to be separate when it comes to making money. So I want to keep moving here. We have 2 slides left before we get into our conversation with Jim and Courtney. So key best practices for coaches. The first thing that we recommend is that a coach have somebody on their staff that is 100% dedicated. I'm not saying create a new position. I'm saying it's your assistant, it's your operations person, somebody that is the utility person for all things NIL. They have a lockstep relationship with whoever is managing NIL in the compliance or in the institutional side of things. And that they also know each and every single one of your student athletes' representatives. So they are the liaison to your student athletes' agents, to their parents, to their roommates, whoever is representing your student athletes' interest. There has to be someone on staff that you can say, hey, who's John working with? And what was the deal that John just did? You need to know all of these things because eligibility is going to be a major factor. To that end, make sure that your student athletes are clarifying and identifying each individual who is representing their NIL interests. It means, do they have an agent? If they don't have an agent, is their parent doing deals for them? Is their parent on Open Doors looking for deals? Is it their friend? Is it anyone else? You want to know who is looking and talking on behalf of your student athlete because that is a compliance issue. And there are going to be a lot of people. We all know in this sport of basketball and football, these student athletes have these big groups, their posses. There's lots of people. Maybe it's their AAU coach. Their student athlete needs to tell you who that is. And you have to just be open and transparent about it. This is not like sneaky. You're not going to, you just want to know so you don't have any surprises. You want to have an open door policy when it comes to NIL. The students don't have to talk about the deals, right? Because you can't stop them from signing a deal. But it would be great, though, if you knew that they were going to do a deal, right? Wouldn't it help if before they just reported the deal to the TPA, they actually came and said, hey, coach, I'm thinking about doing an endorsement with this company. Give me some advice. That is what you want to do. You want to create an environment of transparency with your student athletes. You want to try to get them to actually have conversations with you. But again, there is no obligation for them to do that. You need to educate your boosters and do it as soon as possible. That's not sending an email and saying, hey, NIL is a thing, don't deal with our student athletes. You got to bring them in. You got to have an event maybe in the preseason, and you have to have a conversation with them like we're having now and make it very clear what they can and cannot do. And maybe that's more of a school policy, but if you're having conversations, if you have donors that are traveling to games with you, that is an issue now, right? You have to think about, is that donor involved in a transaction? Is that donor work for a brand that is sponsoring one of our student athletes? And can that be seen as an improper benefit in the process? Lastly, setting clear boundaries, right? Making it very clear when and student athletes can create content. And this is not just paid content. This is any kind of content. Yes, you want your student athletes to do certain things, but if they're using your practice time to create TikTok videos because they're trying to grow their social media followings, that may not be okay with you. And so even if it's non-revenue producing activity, but that has some sort of tangential relationship to NIL, you have to be careful about that and you have to make it very clear what you can do. And then the last thing is again, the transparency element of it is expressing support for NIL. If you come at NIL and say, hey, listen, we're not about that here. We're about the program. We're about winning games. We don't want these distractions. You're going to lose your student athletes. NIL is a real thing. It is here and it is going to be here to stay. And if you don't embrace it, good luck. Okay, because you're going to probably be out of a job because most of your student athletes are going to go somewhere where they can get an opportunity to make money and monetize their NIL. So early best practices for departments as a whole. So the first thing is that departments, once you make a decision as a department, you have to make sure that your coaches are on board and that they are ambassadors of those decisions with their student athletes, meaning that there is one single message from each coach to every student athlete, and that message does not change from teams. You can't have, there's no more social media bans. Sorry, people. There is no more individual bans on certain things. If one coach has a policy as it relates to when you can do social media and when you can't during, the day, it has to be an athletics-wide decision. Okay, because it's going to get from one student athlete to the next, and with the student athletes having power today, it's just going to end up badly for the coach. It's going to end up badly for the school. You have to make sure your student athletes know who your corporate partners are. Again, you can't control whether or not they sign, with Nike if you're an Adidas school, but it is kind of smart to help them know, hey, by the way, we do work with these companies, because that may end up helping them get a deal. It also may help them not run into their own trouble, because maybe a partner that wants to partner with them doesn't realize that you're a competing school. They may not even want to do a deal with your student athlete if they knew that you were partnered with a law firm and they want exclusive access to the school. And right, you have to think about that. And so transparency works both ways. Let your student athletes know what companies your institution is working with. You have to provide and this is like an obvious no-brainer, but you have to provide your athletes with education on hiring agents, legal components of contract. So that's mandated. But a lot of institutions don't have these programs. And a lot of them are saying, how am I going to do this? There are resources out there. Yes, there's Altius, and yes, but you can go to Game Plan today, for example, and get a relatively cheap e-learning platform for all of these things for your student athletes. And it doesn't matter. You can be a Division II, Division III coach and a low major coach. You can afford to do that right now. It's not like a $50,000 thing. These things are available to your student athletes today, and they don't require you to sign a $200,000 deal with Open Doors to make it happen. Make sure that your trainers and mental health providers are aware of what your student athletes are doing and the NIL activities that they're engaged in, because they have a job to do and they need to know what's happening. We know how much student athletes are struggling today with mental health. What happens if a student athlete does a deal and all of a sudden that deal gets pulled, or now they're not getting enough playing time anymore? Not only do they have to worry about not playing, they got to worry about the fact that they're going to lose thousands of dollars that they're sending home to pay for, their parents' rent. That's an issue. And your student athletes and the people that are working with them, they need to be made aware of everything that's going on from an NIL standpoint. Set up a time to provide opportunities to utilize department resources. So remember, earlier we said that student athletes, you can't help student athletes create content and do certain things, but you can help them build their brands, right? That's what Influencer does. That's what Open Doors does. There are opportunities that you can do to allow them to create things. You can build their brand. You can't help monetize their brand, but you can help them create a huge social media following, and then they can figure out how to actually monetize it later on. And lastly, NIL, and we said this a little bit earlier, and I want to remind you guys, NIL means that student athletes are going to be able to do business with other companies, not just do endorsements. So for career services, now all of a sudden you have a really cool catch, because you can start getting your student athletes opportunities that maybe weren't necessarily available. And so there's a line that you have to follow in that process, but it's certainly an option. And leveraging a company like Game Plan or InX Athlete to be able to build career services program around your NIL program is certainly something that we all want to do. So I am going to now invite Gosha and Jim Cavale onto our stage here. Jim, are you with us? Gentlemen, it's good to see you this evening. So I want to provide our participants with some perspective from people that are currently engaged in NIL on a day-to-day basis. Jim, you're the founder of Influencer. You have been Mr. NIL here for the last couple of years, ahead of the game. Talk to me about everything that you're seeing programs doing right now, and what are the opportunities today that coaches and athletic departments can be doing to help their student athletes embrace NIL and maximize their opportunities?
Yeah, Jason, I've actually been able to tune in for a lot of this, and I think you did a great job laying things out. Everybody on here is getting a ton of value from the context you've provided. So some of my answer may be a little repetitive, but a lot of the things that you can do have nothing to do with what the rules are, and have everything to do with you building the foundation to help your student athletes participate safely in this new era of college sports while protecting your institution. And so, the first one is brand building. And I heard you touch on it a bunch, but we started in 2017. NIL wasn't a thing. I mean, the O'Bannon case had happened. The Alston case was in motion. People had, mentioned that NIL could happen at some point, but we started purely as a company that would help teams that wanted to build the brands of their student athletes have resources to offer them. And, we built a business doing that without NIL even being in play, because a lot of schools realize that just like you have to have great facilities and a nice weight room that they can train in, good training facilities for recovery and nutrition, all these, the barber chair in the locker room, the arms race, right? Like, brand building has become, before NIL was even a thing, part of the arms race. And what is brand building? What does that mean? Well, first of all, you have to have people on staff that are creating great content. And that content cannot just be photography, that's part of it, but it also should be short form video, long form video. It also should be graphical and design. And all of that content should be made available to the athletes. Athletes have wanted content since you've been shooting it. I mean, talk to an athlete that played in the 90s and he's an alum or she's an alum of your institution. Ask them if they want some pictures from when they played. I bet they do. And by the way, if you're doing fundraising, that's a great hook to get them involved in a campaign. But anyway, so listen, that starts with producing great content. You've got to do that. Then it comes down to, how are you going to make that content available in a timely manner to your student athletes? Not 2 weeks after it's shot, but 2 minutes or 2 hours. Because you want your athletes to celebrate a huge win on social media just as much as your team account does, because they actually have more followers collectively than your team account. There isn't an institution that has a team account with more followers than the collective of their student athletes. Not even Duke, with 1 million followers on Instagram, has more collective followers than their team, because they attract big name athletes that come in with 1 million followers on their own, like Zion Williamson. So your collective following on average is only 1/3 of the total following that you can reach. So that's big. Now you're talking about, by giving content to your student athletes, not only are they going to post it to grow their following, but they're actually going to help you reach more people. And I think that is what has been embraced by our clients and teams over the last 3 years, before, once again, NIL was in play. So you got to produce great content, you got to make it available to athletes. And then building brands also means giving athletes metrics. You should be tracking the content and where it's shared, by which athletes, to which social mediums, and how many people it reaches. And you should also be tracking where they were on social when they show up on campus, as far as their follower number, as far as their engagement, and where they are in the present. All of these metrics are important because they help you see how the brand building is actually happening. It creates a tangible story for you to see. And so create great content, make it available to athletes, and track it. track what they're doing with it. Track it for them to see their growth. Track it for you to see what's happening for your team or your university. And so that's not a new message for me. Anybody who's listened to me talk before, you're like, dang, Jim, you're a broken record. But that's how we built our company, that one thing. And nobody should be paralyzed by whatever the NIL rules are going to be from doing that, because you can do that anyways. And it plays into NIL more now than ever before, because if you're building your student athlete's brand, you're building their earnings potential. And that's really going to be a mind-blowing thing in 2 years when you're able to show how they've realized that earnings potential with actual transactions. That's when this is really going to hit the recruiting road. But building brands, that's the first step. The second step is educate. You talked about it with game plan. You know, we've had to build a ton of education in our system. We've had to partner with subject matter experts, because athletes not only need to learn how to build their brand, but they need to know financial literacy. They need to know financial literacy, by the way, is not just like how to take care of your money. It's, hey, if you're the 1 out of 5 student athletes that have a Pell Grant, here's your threshold of earnings before you lose the eligibility to have that Pell Grant. You know, financial literacy is, here's how tax compliance works. Financial literacy is, here's how fair market value works with pro athletes and celebrities. And here's some learnings you can take from that to your fair market value. So education is another thing that you need to do. And whether you're partnering with a platform like Influencer to provide a learning management system to the student athlete, or you're just being resourceful and going on campus to the business school, to the marketing school, to some of the knowledge bases you already have on campus to tap into creating an accredited course for student athletes to go through. You know, a set of office hours once a week for student athletes to show up for. You need to have education available. And then thirdly, you need to showcase the brand impact you're having on student athletes. Now, I talked about building their brands, right? But the brand effect that your institution's having, you should be documenting that. I mean, when I first came into this space in 2017, one thing I heard a lot of was folks who might have been against NIL as it came up would say, you know, people all talk about the value that the student athlete brings to the institution, but they don't understand how much value the institution brings to the athlete. And while I don't agree with that argument as it pertains to preventing student athlete from realizing their NIL, I think that they should. I do think there's an exchange. And I said Zion earlier, and he gets used all the time, but I actually like using him for this example. Zion showed up at Duke with 1 million followers on Instagram. Now, he's an outlier, right? We all know that. But whether you show up with 10,000 followers, 1,000 followers, or 1 million followers, think about this. He left Duke with 3.5 million followers. He wasn't even there for a year. What's the power of playing in the ACC, playing at Duke, playing on ESPN every night, playing, in a stage like March Madness? He made it so far in March Madness, but still, he played on that stage. That's powerful, right? Now, in basketball, especially, I was just at Ole Miss yesterday. I get talking to basketball coaches. I get a chance to talk to coaches a lot. Basketball coaches are up against not just, other schools now in recruiting. They're up against overtime. They're up against the G League. You have to know whether you're a basketball coach going up against other schools overtime in the G League, or just, you're in women's volleyball and you're going up against a school in your conference. You should be able to convey the brand impact your school has if student athlete X that you're trying to recruit comes there. How do you know that? Go back to that brand building function I started with. What's the average student athlete show up with for followers? What's the average student athlete leave with for followers? What's the average percentage growth your school has for its student athletes? You have to sell that. That is now the same component as when your strength coach comes in and says, hey, we had Josh Allen show up at Kentucky, 185 pounds, and he was 6'3", and he left 255 and became the 7th pick in the NFL draft linebacker, right? Those stats for strength are the same stats you now need for brand. And so you have to be able to convey that in the recruiting process. And of course, the the last set of stats in that conversation starting next year will be, and not only do we grow the average student athlete's brand by this percentage and this many followers, but we actually had these transactions happen on our campus last year by our student athletes. And this was the earnings opportunities that were created just from coming to a stage like this school. So build your athletes' brands, educate your student athletes, showcase your student athletes' brand growth, the brand impact your school's having. And then lastly, transact transparently. And so this is really important. You have to, the schools that are ahead of the curve right now, and I preach this especially to our schools that are in Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, and Florida, because they're about to go live in 21 days. You should be practicing with whatever system you're going to use. If you use our system, we're saying, hey, let's run mock data through Influencer Verify, which is our compliance ledger, and let's make sure that at least your SAC student athletes can test it out. And if you want to get some other student athletes involved, let's create some mock situations of how we're going to transact transparently. What happens when a local company comes to a student athlete with a DM or a phone call? Heard that example earlier. How does the student athlete report that when we can't get student athletes to say how many tickets they need for their parents on Monday? Let's test that out. At the same time, let's test out the automated ways we can make it easy for student athletes. For us, that's connecting to digital marketplaces. For others, it could be something else. But what are ways we can mitigate how much they even have to do to report, right? But let's transact transparently, and let's have compliance ready to communicate, hopefully with technology, with the student athlete to get a transaction approved. Because in Mississippi and Alabama, for instance, if you read the state laws, one big difference is you're not going to collect the money until the compliance team has approved the transaction. So imagine a student athlete gets a deal, they're real excited, they're going to be, all of a sudden, they're going to be knocking compliance's door down, right? So how can we make that easy? How can we be ready for that? So those four things, when Jason asked me what to talk about, I made it up, and it stands for BEST. Build your athletes' brands, educate your student athletes, showcase the brand impact of your institution, and transact transparently. No matter what the rules are, you can be doing that right now.
Jim, I appreciate that. And I love the example of overtime in the G League, in particular for basketball coaches. That is happening at a time now when NIL, it's kind of fortuitous that schools will have a chance to counter that, right? And I believe when you say that Duke and Ohio State and North Carolina and Texas, these are massive brands in themselves that have a lot of firepower, and they're going to be able to fight back. And quite frankly, a lot of these kids that are going to the overtime leagues could probably end up making more money through NIL if done the right way with the right support by playing for one of these brands, because a Duke has a heck of a lot more brand equity than Overtime Elite does right now. And that's value that the institutions are going to be able to bring to bear for these student athletes in all sports.
Yeah, the thing that's tough about this right now is the way a lot of the legislation's written. It's limiting the institution so much from leveraging that power, and we've heard Bubba Cunningham talk about this, and as far as group licensing or just the ability to do group things together. There's such an opportunity when you go to, especially an institution like those examples you gave, to create group opportunities. And there's this myth that you need a union, you need some sort of organized situation for group to happen. And what's crazy is there's so many, in pro sports, the group opportunity is pretty simple. There's 32 teams, there's this many athletes, we're going to create a group opportunity with the PA. But in college, you could group together all the teams at one school and have a group opportunity between a brand and the school's student athletes. You could do a group opportunity with all the schools in a specific state for a regional brand that likes the state of Mississippi and wants to do something with all the schools in that state. You could do all the sports in one conference, one sport in one conference. So you could take football in the SEC and create a group deal just for football. You also could do all the sports in one conference. There's a lot of ways group could be set up, and you could leverage the prestige and tradition of an institution or a league to really create an opportunity to do what group does best, at the pro level, which is help every athlete realize some value. And I think, one thing about the legislation, wherever we end up, I was talking to a prominent agency today and a bunch of agents, and they're just doing a Q&A like this. And I said, whatever the rules are, we all know it's going to evolve, right? There's going to be version 1.0, and then it's going to evolve. We're going to see what works and what doesn't. But I'm a big believer that group could be something that really opens up a lot of win-win situations for the institution and the athletes, especially at institutions with prestige, like the examples you gave.
Courtney, I want to move to you, but I just want to mention to everybody else, this is an open session. So if you guys have questions, put them in the Q&A or even raise your hand, and we could actually have you guys speak. So love to answer any questions that anyone has. Courtney, talk to me. You guys are in a unique situation. You're in Florida, right? So July 1, things are going to get real. You've had to start preparing your student athletes and your department for this. I want to hear what you guys are doing. And then I also want to talk about a little bit about, FAMU, it's an HBCU, and NIL is, in my opinion, going to be the single greatest thing that ever happened to HBCU sports, because there are going to be so many opportunities for so many student athletes to finally be able to build a brand. We've already seen with the level of recruits that are coming to schools. We got Hersey Miller headed to Tennessee State. This is an amazing opportunity. Talk to me about what FAMU is doing to take advantage and be ahead of the curve come July 1 with everything.
So Jason, you're absolutely right. And, and I'll just kind of echo some of Jim's point. It's about brand and brand awareness. We tell our staff, brand is perception, perception drives choice. And, going back to your presentation, you looked at the map of the country right now, and I call it the heat map. You're looking at that southern region, and it's hot right now. You've got Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas is warming up. But for us on the recruiting trail, recruits that we might not have ever had the opportunity to be engaged with are looking at Florida A&M now. And not because of really the environment that, we're an HBCU, we're the number one public HBCU in the country, but it's the fact that we are actively participating in name, image, and likeness. And, I think institutional education is also important. So yes, we understand that we have to educate our staff, our student athletes, but this has been a topic at my senior leadership, because the first thing was, this is a Power 5 issue. We're not in that conversation. I said, well, I beg to differ. My first couple of weeks on the job, we did case studies of every single student athlete that we have. And I believe Coach McCollum's on the call today, but we have one men's basketball player who has 1 million followers on TikTok. And again, the ability to be able to monetize that is something that's naturally going to happen. And so you talk about the exposure, you use Tennessee State as an example, and kind of the movement that's happening right now. I think student athletes at HBCUs are going to be able to garner that exposure at a very, very high level. I think Jim also mentioned female student athletes. I think one of the odd requests that I got a couple months ago, and it was interesting, I think I saw a Front Office Sports article about it, but Floyd Mayweather had signed a deal with, OnlyFans. And, that has come up in our conversations with our student athletes. And it's like, okay, that's a first, but let's talk about it. And having that open door policy is something that every athletic director, every head coach is going to have to adapt to. I think we're seeing the landscape of intercollegiate athletics at all levels change very quickly. And to your point, we as athletic administrators and our policies and our procedures are going to have to be malleable as well. There's a lot of operating in the gray, as we talk about, that will happen. And I think we're going to learn from each other. I think everybody who's ready to hit the ground July 1, I think we're going to look around, we're going to be reading the headlines and saying what's happening, right? And those who are going to be delayed, I think will learn from whether we call them mistakes or opportunities that exist from that group that will hit the ground running first. But again, I definitely think it's a time in our industry that's really defining it. It's defining recruiting. It's defining really roles within athletic departments. Your typical sports information director is not what you're looking for these days. I think departments are investing in digital strategists. because it's about how do we strategize to connect brands, to prepare ourselves for this in particular. And it's a slippery slope. It's going to be a new space, and I think a space that we have to be ready to operate within. I think the educational piece is something that most athletic departments have always provided, the financial literacy, but the depth of that financial literacy, I think, is the thing that will certainly change. But you mentioned, again, the ability for our student athletes to identify those opportunities. We are a low resource mid-major in Tallahassee, Florida. But you would be amazed at how many hometown heroes we have that can go out and leverage a local deal with substantial value. And so that's really kind of been our grassroots approach to that, is really evaluating those opportunities because they're coming. They're coming very rapid. And so for an athletic director, I think it's about being malleable, understanding that brand is driving this thing. And so what is your brand as an institution? And then how are you essentially connecting that brand to today's student athlete and the opportunities that may come along with it? Our law, I can tell you for the past 6 months, it was actively engaged with legislators, with student athletes, and trying to really understand how we operate and monitor and regulate deregulation, because essentially that's what we're facing. And so, to that point, again, the student athlete experience is also one of those opportunities to use and highlight that brand and your institutional profile as well. So that's kind of been our piece, and again, just understanding the marketplace, understanding where we fit. Are all brands equal? No, they're not. And I think we have to recognize that. But I do think there's greater opportunity on both sides of the spectrum. We talked about those traditional brands. I had a cup of coffee at the University of Miami, a premier brand, right? And there will be some things that they will be able to do very easily. And I've had some conversations with Blake James about that. And the reverse for us, there's some things that we'll be able to do and identify, especially on the recruiting trail that we haven't had access to before. But to your point, I would say education, making sure that you're educating your staff on the kind of the do's and the don'ts. We've had to really beef up and ensure that our compliance personnel has the resources at their exposure as things arise. And so that's kind of been our piece of it. But the mental health piece, and so I think, Jim, you mentioned this as well. Your athletic trainers, your mental health specialists, they do need to know because that is so interconnected to that student athlete experience and the brand of your institution. And so the ability to have open relationships with your student athletes to understand that and how that plays into marketplace as well.
Awesome insight, Korte. There's an interesting question here from Eric. Should athletes consider hiring their own personal content creators, and should schools help facilitate that? I think that's an interesting. You talk about digital strategists. I don't know how many digital strategists Florida A&M can hire, right? But is it enough, right? Can student athletes, and Jim, have you seen this? I mean, there's going to be a cottage industry, I think, that's going to come out of this with NIL, with people offering all kinds of services. I mean, we know, I think, Jim, Tipton works for you, right? Like, if, kids are hiring people to do their recruiting announcement videos. Are we going to see them creating, content for them? And what's going to happen in that space? And how are schools going to deal with that?
I think that is going to be an evolution. And at the high school level, you mentioned Joe Tipton, who's on our team and done a bunch of great stuff with us. He's built an amazing, career off of that, and it's going to catapult him now that he's graduating from college into, I think, some really awesome stuff. And so just like there's young folks who excel on the court or the field, there's now young people who, starting in high school, are excelling at creating content. And then there's ones that do both. And that's the TikTok guy at Florida A&M. And that's the point I really want to drive home. This is not easy. This is going to be very competitive. This is the same as getting playing time or being good enough to make it to scholarship level at a university. And so I had 500 student athletes in front of me yesterday at Ole Miss. And I said, you probably think that on July 1st, we're just going to flip a switch and all of a sudden the floodgates are going to open, but that's just not the case.
Right.
What you put in is what you get out. And now that could be concerning for coaches to hear. Coaches are thinking, Jim, we already have time management constraints. I can only work with the student athletes so often in the weight room, on the court. Then they got to go to class. Now you're telling me that I should be telling them to put in the work on social media so that they can build their brand. And I'm not saying that, but I am saying that this is going to take, like, student athletes have to post often. They have to be creative. They have to tell their story beyond being an athlete. Let me give you an example. Amani Bates, like one of the best high school basketball players in the country. Guy has not posted one time on Instagram. He has 500,000 followers. Go to his Instagram. He might have one post. That's the cool thing now, by the way, with blue chip recruits. They delete all their posts and they just have like 1 or 6, and they have like, 1 million followers. What he doesn't understand is when a brand is looking at him and another athlete that maybe only has 300,000 followers, but that other athlete posts often. You can go to their profile, see what they do, see what they're about, see that they're an athlete, but see that they're also an activist for this movement, that they're actually really musical and they play this instrument, that they have this story about their family that connects to this audience. Brands love that. Brands are going to spend money with the other guy instead of Amani. And so athletes have to understand that, like, this is a game here digitally, and they have to put in the work. Part of it may be getting a content creator. That's a great question, Eric. And I think it will be something that happens more and more, because I think there's young content creators that will be smart enough to DM athletes. They're already doing it. That's what Joe Tipton does for high school athletes, by the way. If you see him doing announcements, all he does is text or to DM Amani Bates and say, hey, can I do your announcement? Or Chet Holmgren, hey, can I do your announcement graphic? And Chet doesn't pay Joe Tipton anything, but Joe Tipton's happy to do it because he's young and he's building his resume. And so I think you're going to see a lot of that kind of stuff happen. But it is important to understand, like, the ones who are going to really win, doesn't matter if what platform they use, what market, they have to put in the work.
I think we have a question which we're going to get through from Robert McCummon. But Courtney, I had a question for you. What keeps you up at night with NIL? What are you worried about? And I'm sure there's a lot of things, but this is unprecedented. We've had this conversation a lot, and I don't know if people on this session realize this is going to be the Wild West in a lot of ways come July 1. It's going to get figured out eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later. But different states with different laws, there's going to be fortunes made and lost in a couple of months, because people are going to figure out how to game the system to their advantage, which is okay, because that's where we've come to, right? We've kind of pushed ourselves as an industry into this corner. What are you thinking about, Courtney? And I don't want you to reveal the playbook, because I know you guys have some stuff in the pipe that's probably going to blow our minds. But what are some of the things that you're doing to make sure that your student athletes don't get taken advantage of? Talk about that.
Absolutely. Well, I'll say this. At one point, they told me I was the youngest Division I AD, but I've lost a lot of real estate on this hairline this year, dealing with this topic. And so, I think that's a great question, because this is an issue that keeps us up at night. There's a lot of reading engagement at a very high level, I think, with ADs across the country around this topic. And the reality is, to your point, there has been a shift in the power structure within our industry. And so as an athletics director, how do you manage the enterprise without the ability to enforce elements within the enterprise? And so I think that's the piece that's going to be the skill set that's probably going to be utilized the most for coaches and athletic administrators moving forward. In particular, our state law, I think it provides a very, very natural framework. In particular, it requires our student athletes have to disclose, any contracts that he or she plans to engage into. And that manner is designated by the institution. It's very broad. So it does give us some authority and autonomy, but it's still very broad in nature. It also, requires that there's no conflicts with the institution. And, initially 3-4 months ago, the element of how litigious this issue would be is really the thing that kind of gives you nightmares, because, hey, we've got some major revenue generating contracts. Is NIL going to conflict with that now? How do we operate within the higher education model where, contracts and head coaching agreements and all of those type things come into play when you're recruiting now student athletes? And so, again, I'm very favorable of the Florida law and the frameworks that it's provided us. I do think there will be that evolution and other iterations as we see things and new issues arise that no one really anticipated. And so, but I think the thing that really keeps us up at night is how litigious this topic may be. And it's not going to be, the legal issues that we face here in Florida are going to be totally different from states around the country because of just how different all of these legislations are. And so it will be interesting, but you're seeing ADs bow out. I think we've seen 24 ADs over the past couple of months say, you know what, I'm not going to deal with this one. And so, again, leadership is really important at this time. And I think you're going to have to see leadership change and evolve as well as the landscape of this industry does.
Appreciate that, Courtney. I think we have Ray who's going to ask a question here. I think we're going to unmute him for a moment. Troy can.
It's Robert.
Oh, Robert. Excuse me. Sorry, Robert.
Yeah, Robert McCollum, FAMU.
I know you.
So, gosh, I don't know. There's so much great info. I've run out of 5x7 index cards. An issue, in addition to the legislation in the state of Florida, a big elephant in the room is going to be the advantages, disadvantages from a tax standpoint. And you look at the state of Florida, the state of Texas, and what maybe the state of Washington. I don't know if there's another where there's no state taxes.
Tennessee.
Where it's there's a reason that Tiger Woods made his Florida, same with Shaq. When Shaq left the Magic, Florida remained his place of residence. And so I was looking the other day, the state of California income tax is 13.3%. And in Florida, we have none. So just, but how can you not frame that? Because from a compliance standpoint, you all talked about wanting to be open dialogue, embrace NIL, which kind of reminds me of years ago. A lot of coaches didn't embrace their kids leaving school after a year, and it backfired on them. So this should be a lesson to those coaches who were against this in the late 90s, at the turn of the decade of the century here. But how do we deal with that from a compliance standpoint? Trying to, as coaches, we know it's an advantage recruiting a kid from another state who we know that may have the potential from an earning standpoint or whatever. Korte talked about a Bryce Moraine. Bryce is a kid that came to us as a walk-on. How about that? As a walk-on, now he's one of our best players, starter, one of our leaders. And Korte already acknowledged his followers. But talk about the tax, if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah,
please.
Robert, and I think when I mentioned earlier about, so you can't promise a kid that he's going to make a certain amount of money.
Sure.
You can say, we have a student athlete on our team who's done a deal with, Home Depot, and he's making $50,000 a year. And by the way, there's no state income tax in Florida. Okay. So you can mention that. And I'm just sitting here imagining Dan Mullen in a living room right now in Florida doing a presentation, trying to get a kid over, USC and saying, you're going to make, a lot more money because you're not going to be paying crazy California taxes. But that's absolutely an advantage.
Absolutely.
And that will be something that you guys got to use. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So we had a question that's somewhat similar. How do schools and states that aren't live July 1 compete? I'd love to hear Jim say that, because I don't know if it matters if you go July 1 or not. It's going to happen fast, but there's so much legwork that needs to get done for every institution in every state that's worth considering and thinking about here.
Yeah, so the question is, how do schools compete as far as recruiting, or
Yes.
is it just in general?
Yeah, I just in general.
I think that it's still such an unproven ground. I think Courtney said it best. I mean, if anything, the states that have it in play, while they do have a first mover advantage, are also going to be, testers for these waters that other states can learn from. And I don't think it's going to be this huge disadvantage unless we're talking about years of an interim period, which we all know is not going to happen. If anything, it's going to be months. So I don't see a lot of folks panicking. I mean, obviously we saw Mark Few today, on the Hill, talk about the disadvantage of being in a state that doesn't have a law. And I think it's a valid point, but I think everybody knows that there's going to be NIL in the next calendar year, or even if the state that doesn't have legislation. And, while it could be a little bit of a disadvantage, I actually think it's an advantage for both. So if you're in a state that has it starting July 1st, let's build the case study, right, Courtney? Let's get some great stories happening at FAMU, and let's tell those stories next year. Let's build that now, right? And we can even, Coach McCollum, we can even throw in the income tax thing, because we'll actually have transaction show didn't have a state tax to them, right? On the same token, if I'm in Kentucky and there's no state law, I'm watching this, but I'm getting caught up and ready to go, and I'm going to be ready to really press a button with the things I talked about, like brand building, education, showcasing the brand impact, transacting transparently. But even with some of the learning going on, I think you've got to look at that as an advantage too. So everybody has the advantage of finding a way to make this unique to your school. And that's something that they should be working on regardless. So I don't see it as a huge disadvantage, even though there are folks who are claiming that, it isn't apples to apples because they don't have a state law.
Right. And I agree with you on that, Jim. There's, maybe there's a little bit of an advantage right now. It's not going to be a long one. And as I mentioned earlier, there are student athletes, there are universities, there are going to be people that are going to get hurt and are going to get burned through this. And the advantage of not being one of the early states is that you can learn and watch from other people's lessons to make sure that something doesn't happen, or that you see something go wrong here or something, because it's going to be chaos, right?
There's this myth in business that you have to be first, and it's true. We started our company in 2017. Open Doors had been around for 6 years. You know what I mean? But there was a place for us to find our niche.
Right.
And we become the first two players in this. You mentioned that earlier in your presentation, but there's also a bunch of new companies now, and there'll be a few that see gaps that Open Doors and Influencer don't solve, and they'll find their ways with that. That's what you do. You get in, you figure out the market. That's business. And it's the same thing as us. Like, when you're venture backed, which we are, you don't think that our board would love for us to do. You showed those 3 different options for a company like us to make money. There's charging the institution, making money off of student transactions, and being the TPA. You don't think that the other 2 look really, really great, big opportunities or big financial opportunities, but we've said no to them because we've got to get into this and show allegiance to the ones we've been working with since the beginning, and that is the institution. So we are 100% focused on these. That's why we withdrew from the finalist position we had with the TPA and the NCAA. That's why we don't do marketplace activities. You got to come into this, and you got to kind of like tiptoe in, and you got to look at the environment and figure out how can you maximize value, and then progress as time goes on. So when I'm sitting in a room with an athletic director and her executive staff, and we're talking strategy, the whole conversation is around progressions. What's progression 1? What's the assumption about progression 2, 3, and 4? And maybe there's 6-month progressions. How can we now go back to those assumptions every month and see what we were right about and see what we were wrong about and keep adjusting that strategy? So we have a 2-year, 3-year strategy. We have these 4 progressions in our strategy with all these assumptions of what we can and can't do, and we keep revisiting it. It's not just one conversation, it's an ongoing conversation. And that's what I think everybody has to understand about this is it's not like you're going to figure everything out today. It's just not possible. But that doesn't mean you paralyze yourself with analysis either. You just create a plan and you keep going back to it as you go through it.
Right. And I was going to mention even more so, the big brands, and I've emphasized this a lot during this presentation, are not jumping into this right now. They're going to be backseat. It's going to be a year before we see these big brands get in. And so there's plenty of time. And so if your local car dealership is going to go want to sign one of your student athletes, it doesn't matter if they do it in July 1 or July 1 of next year. They're still going to be there, right? It's not like your student athletes are going to be missing any opportunities. So the slow play here, there is an advantage. And I think there's maybe more of an advantage if you're not a July 1 state because you have more time to get yourself ready.
Yeah, another thing, Jason, on that is, when you look at this, when you look at the sports market in general, there's only so many marketing dollars, right? It's not like all these new marketing dollars are just going to be created. If you just look at it as a numerator denominator fraction, like the numerator being the dollars that is spent in sports advertising with athletes or schools or pro teams, it's pretty fixed, right? It goes up a little bit every year, pretty fixed. The denominator is the one that's about to change. There's about to be a ton of new choices for that money to be spent with.
Yep.
So if you just do the math, what is that going to do? It's going to drive down cost per transaction, cost per deal. And so that's the other thing you have to realize with this is we are about to have on July 1st and throughout the next few months, a bunch of new choices for advertisers, which is only going to make it more competitive for athletes, teams, and whoever's competing for those dollars. And I don't feel like enough people are talking about that and what that's going to do. I know schools are a little worried that they might have a signage sponsor who backs out of their deal with the MMR and spends half as much with the quarterback.
Yep.
And can maybe think they might get more value out of it.
Yeah.
That's where this could go.
Yeah.
Especially in kind of the local market. We talked about those hometown heroes, that affinity to that institutions because my son Johnny was the star quarterback at the local high school. And I want to, I want to make sure Johnny's good and I'm going to take care of him now. And those are some of the challenges that very well may exist. And I think over the next month or two, you'll see them start to evolve even more.
Sure. So we're nearing 10 o'clock here, so I'm going to try to wrap it up. There's one question I want to answer, and then I want to get a final statement from you guys on your thoughts. But somebody asked, what happens when a student athlete potentially, we talked about student athletes suing the school. What about a student athlete getting sued for breach of contract for not fulfilling one of their deals? That is absolutely going to happen. I mean, we know that we see pro athletes not being dependable. What is an 18 to 22-year-old going to do? Sign a contract and then not show up and do something? That is absolutely, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of brands are going to tiptoe into this because they don't want to put money on the line unless they know for a fact that somebody's going to show up and actually make it happen. And so it's going to be minimal deals and there's going to be a lot of hand holding, but I guarantee there's going to be a big market for lawyers representing student athletes in breach of contract cases on endorsements and all kinds of things because kids are going to make mistakes. It's just going to happen, just like pro athletes do. So Courtney and Jim, do you have any kind of final statements, thoughts before we go tonight on what ADs, what coaches should be thinking about here over the next couple of weeks and months as we enter this new era of NIL?
And I'll say, I think it's been one of those things that we've all really had to educate ourselves. And you want to align with partners like Influencer or Open Doors who can help provide, again, a guidance and a framework as we approach this. There are going to be a lot of lessons learned, and I don't know that there's an AD sitting in the chair that says, I have all the answers to these questions as right now. I think our compliance staffs are going to be more important than ever, as we walk down this space. But again, as I mentioned earlier, I think that our industry is being redefined with this legislation and the way that we operate as we move forward. ADs are going to have to be a little bit more engaged in the student athlete experience, just to be frank, to understand, who are on our rosters as we're recruiting student athletes and what is their profile. And institutionally, is that something that we want to do, and what comes along with that? And so, again, it's been a fun year. But again, as Jim mentioned, I think the next year or two are really going to be interesting. When you see some returns from some of these elements come to fruition. And so, educate yourselves, educate your staff as much as possible. And I think we will learn from each other over the next couple of years.
Appreciate it, Courtney. Jim?
Yeah, I'm actually going to quote one of my friends in this industry, Casey Schwab from Altius, who constantly reminds me, it's a long game. This is not an overnight thing. I mentioned the progressional strategy. I think every school should we all have, when we do an annual strategy, we divide it into quarters, do a 2-3 year strategy and just throw everything out there and make assumptions and kind of, give yourself room to have, top 2 to 3 priorities every 6 months and assume what they'll be for the first, second months, the third, the fourth, and then keep revisiting them and come back to them, adjust them with what we learn. And I think if you approach it that way, you give yourself room to do what I call gap thinking. And so you got the ideals, you can paint them all. We all want to have, 100% compliance and no controversies on campus and, whatever those measurements are, certain amount of dollars made by our athletes that we can talk about in recruiting and also celebrate for them, whatever those, that's the ideal. And then today you're at 0, no activity. Leave yourself room to end up in the, because it's going to be a long game. And so I think that's the biggest thing you need to realize as you go into this as a leader. You need to really make sure you have clarity for your entire staff so that they realize it too.
Agreed. Well, gentlemen, thank you for your views tonight. And I hope that this presentation proved valuable for everybody. And of course, if anyone has any follow-up questions, they can reach out to any of us. I think our contact information is pretty publicly available. So we will post this recording again on ADU and NABC website here in a couple of days. And I'm sure if somebody will ask me for the PowerPoint, we can get that to everybody as well. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great night.